In this video, we delve into the latest developments in Ukraine's war against Russia, focusing on the fierce battles unfolding in the Donetsk and Kursk regions. Ukrainian forces have delivered a devastating blow to Russian armored convoys in Pokrovsk, while Russia attempts a counteroffensive in Kursk. We'll explore the strategic maneuvers, tactical victories, and the critical challenges both sides face as this intense conflict continues to unfold. Stay tuned as we break down how these clashes may shape the future of the war in Ukraine. The recent developments in Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Kursk regions, offer a compelling narrative of strategic maneuvering and military operations, where both sides are trying to outflank and outwit the other. As we dissect the events of the past week, it becomes clear that the Ukrainian forces have implemented a series of well-coordinated attacks, achieving a devastating blow against Russian armored vehicles, while the Russians in response have tried to regroup and shift their focus to the Kursk region. The war in Ukraine, now in its second year, has evolved from large-scale battles into a war of attrition, with tactical ambushes, counterattacks, and strategic positioning dominating the battlefield. What stands out in this latest series of clashes is how both sides are using deception, intelligence, and logistics to try to gain the upper hand. This article will dive into the intricacies of the recent operations, the significance of the heavy Russian losses in Pokrovsk, and how the conflict in Kursk might shape the broader dynamics of the war. The heavy defeat suffered by the Russian forces in Pokrovsk, where 46 armored vehicles were destroyed in a single ambush by Ukrainian forces, signals a significant tactical victory for Ukraine. It also highlights how Russia's long-standing strategy of using armor-heavy convoys to advance its positions is proving increasingly vulnerable in the face of Ukraine's improving reconnaissance capabilities. The video footage released by the Ukrainian Presidential Brigade showing the destruction of a column of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles is not just a morale booster for the Ukrainian forces, but it also serves as a stark reminder to Russia of the changing nature of this war. In this instance, the coordination between the Ukrainian 21st Separate Special Purpose Battalion, 46th Separate Air Transport Brigade, and the 59th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade proved lethal for the Russian armored convoy. These units, equipped with reconnaissance drones and artillery, effectively trapped the Russian forces in a vulnerable position where the sheer mass of their vehicles became a liability rather than an asset. By concentrating their forces in a single column, the Russian convoy made it easy for the Ukrainian forces to launch a precision strike. The Ukrainian military's use of attack UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, to guide artillery strikes was instrumental in destroying the convoy. In modern warfare, the ability to detect, identify, and destroy enemy targets with minimal exposure has become a defining feature of successful operations. The fact that Ukrainian forces were able to accomplish this with such efficiency speaks volumes about their growing capabilities. For Russia, this defeat in Pokrovsk has broader implications. First, it reveals the vulnerabilities in their supply and reinforcement lines, which are critical to sustaining their offensive operations. Second, it underscores the limitations of their current strategy, which relies heavily on traditional mechanized warfare. The Ukrainian success in ambushing the Russian convoy is a reminder that this war is no longer just about brute force or territorial gains. It's about tactical flexibility, intelligence gathering, and effective use of resources. Russia's setback in Pokrovsk is compounded by its decision to shift focus to the Kursk region, where they have launched a counteroffensive. The move appears to be an attempt to divert Ukrainian forces away from other front lines and gain momentum in an area that has seen less fighting in recent months. The Russians deployed elite forces, including the 155th Marine Infantry Brigade, the 106th Airborne Division, and the 56th Air Assault Regiment, to spearhead their offensive in Kursk. Initially, Russian forces appeared to make some progress, crossing the Same River and capturing several settlements along the riverbank. However, as with many of Russia's operations in Ukraine, the initial success was fleeting. The Russian strategy in Kursk is flawed for several reasons. While they have managed to bring large numbers of troops into the region, the lack of a clear operational breakthrough has left them vulnerable. Ukraine's strategy has been to allow the Russians to advance into a trap, essentially luring them into a position where they can be encircled and cut off. The Same River, which the Russians hope to use as a natural barrier, has instead become a choke point for their forces. Ukrainian artillery and airstrikes have made it difficult for Russian forces to maintain supply lines, and any attempt to build a bridge across the river has been met with fierce resistance. One of the more intriguing aspects of this conflict is the role of deception and misdirection. Russia's move into Kursk may have been an attempt to force Ukraine to divert some of its most capable units away from other critical front lines, such as Bakhmut or Kherson. By creating the illusion of a significant offensive in Kursk, Russia likely hoped to stretch Ukrainian forces thin, reducing their ability to respond effectively in other areas. However, this strategy has backfired. Instead of weakening Ukrainian defenses elsewhere, it has allowed Ukraine to concentrate its forces in key areas, while also making the Russians expend resources and manpower in a region that may ultimately prove irrelevant to the overall outcome of the war. The Kursk operation also highlights one of the major challenges Russia faces in this war: logistics. The Russian military is heavily reliant on rail and road transport to move troops and supplies to the front lines. In Kursk, this dependence on fixed supply routes has been a major weakness. The Ukrainian forces, with their increasing access to Western military aid, have been able to disrupt Russian supply lines through targeted strikes. The decision by Western leaders to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles like the ATACMS and Storm Shadow on Russian territory has further complicated Russia's logistics. The introduction of these long-range weapons into the conflict is a game-changer, as it allows Ukraine to strike deep into Russian-held territory, hitting critical infrastructure and supply depots. One of the key challenges for Russia in the Kursk region is sustaining its forces once they have crossed the Siem River. The narrow corridor that the Russian forces are attempting to defend is highly vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery and airstrikes. If Ukraine can continue to disrupt Russian supply lines, it may be only a matter of time before the Russian forces in Kursk are forced to retreat. The situation is reminiscent of earlier battles in the war, where Russia made initial gains but was unable to hold on to them due to logistical issues and Ukrainian counterattacks. For Ukraine, the challenge is to maintain the momentum it has gained in recent weeks. The destruction of the Russian convoy in Pokrovsk and the successful defense of the Siem River in Kursk are significant victories, but they are not decisive. The war is far from over, and Ukraine will need to continue to adapt its strategies to counter Russian tactics. One of the key factors in Ukraine's favor is the continued flow of Western military aid, which has allowed it to replenish its stocks of ammunition and equipment. The decision by Western leaders to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles is a sign that they are committed to supporting Ukraine in the long term, even if it risks escalating the conflict. Looking ahead, the situation in Kursk is likely to remain fluid. While the Russians have managed to bring large numbers of troops into the region, their ability to hold on to their gains is uncertain. The narrow corridor they are attempting to defend is vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks, and the longer they remain in the area, the more difficult it will be for them to sustain their forces. Ukraine, meanwhile, will need to continue to press its advantage, using its superior intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities to identify and exploit Russian weaknesses. In conclusion, the recent developments in Pokrovsk and Kursk offer a glimpse into the broader dynamics of the war in Ukraine. Both sides are engaged in a high-stakes game of chess, where every move has the potential to shift the balance of power. For Ukraine, the key to victory will be maintaining its tactical flexibility, leveraging its intelligence capabilities, and continuing to disrupt Russian supply lines. For Russia, the challenge will be to find a way to break through Ukraine's defenses and regain the initiative. As the conflict enters its third year, the stakes could not be higher for both sides.